When we think about the end of the Second World War, most people immediately imagine the mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The story seems simple. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, Japan surrendered, and the war was over. But history is rarely that straightforward. The real reason Japan lost World War II is far more complex. A tangled mix of military overstretch, economic collapse. The islands themselves were resource poor. Japan had very little oil, very little rubber, very little iron ore. Yet it wanted to be a great empire, one that could rival the Western powers. That ambition pushed Japan into Manchuria in 1931, then into full-scale war with China in 1937, and finally into conflict with the United States and European empires in 1941. From Tokyo's perspective, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a desperate gamble. Japan's leaders believed war with the United States was inevitable because of the oil embargo and the growing tension in Asia. So, instead of waiting, they decided to strike first. The hope was that a devastating blow would shock America into negotiation, buying Japan time to consolidate its new empire across Asia. The military believed that if they could secure Southeast Asia's resources, especially the oil of the Dutch East Indies, they could sustain their war machine. For a brief moment, it looked like the plan was working. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across the Pacific with astonishing speed. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies all fell in rapid succession. The empire stretched thousands of miles, and Japanese propaganda proclaimed the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But this expansion contained the seeds of Japan's defeat. The empire was simply too big, too scattered, and too dependent on fragile supply lines. Unlike Germany, which fought on land and could sustain itself with conquered territories, Japan's empire relied on sea lanes. Oil from Indonesia, rubber from Malaya, rice from Southeast Asia, all of it had to be transported back to the home islands on vulnerable convoys. The U.S. Navy and its submarines would turn these supply lines into graveyards. By 1944, American submarines had sunk so many Japanese merchant ships that the home islands were starving of oil, food, and raw materials. Japan's soldiers were still fighting across Asia, but the factories back home couldn't keep up. Another fatal flaw was Japan's underestimation of American industry. At Pearl Harbor, Japan destroyed battleships, but it failed to destroy aircraft carriers and oil facilities. Within months, the United States had mobilized in a way Japan could never match. American shipyards churned out carriers, destroyers, and submarines at astonishing speed. Factories produced more planes than Japan could ever hope to replace. The imbalance in industrial capacity meant that every Japanese loss on the battlefield was permanent, while America could replace its losses many times over. But material strength wasn't the only factor. Japan's military strategy was often rigid and overconfident. The Battle of Midway in 1942 is the clearest example. Japanese planners assumed they could lure the U.S. From that moment onward, Japan's ability to project power collapsed. Still, the Japanese military did not retreat. Instead, it dug in. On islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese troops fought to the last man. Their culture of Bushido, the warrior code, rejected surrender as dishonorable. This fierce resistance made every battle costly for the Allies, but it also drained Japan's strength. Entire divisions were wiped out. The Navy was bled dry, the Air Force decimated, and pilots increasingly sent on kamikaze missions because fuel and training time were scarce. Japan's leaders hoped that by inflicting massive casualties, they could force the United States into a negotiated settlement. But that hope ignored the political climate in Washington, where unconditional surrender had become a war aim. Another underestimated factor was the role of the Soviet Union. For much of the war, Japan had a neutrality pact with Moscow that allowed Tokyo to focus on the Pacific while avoiding a two-front disaster like Germany faced. But by 1945, when Germany was defeated, Stalin shifted his gaze east. In August of that year, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Entire Japanese armies were smashed in days. This Soviet offensive was arguably just as decisive as the atomic bombs, because it eliminated Japan's last hope of using the Soviets as a mediator for peace. With both the Americans and the Soviets closing in, Japan was trapped. We also have to consider the home front. By 1944, Japan's cities were being bombed nightly. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Industrial output had collapsed. Civilians were living on meager rations. The government fed people propaganda about glorious victory, but the reality was clear. Japan could not fight much longer. And yet, the leadership was divided. Some factions wanted to fight on, even to the last man, while others secretly looked for ways to end the war. This internal division delayed surrender, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. So when the atomic bombs fell, they were not the only reason Japan surrendered. They were the final shock layered on top of years of crushing defeats, starvation, and strategic collapse. The bombs made surrender undeniable, but Japan was already on the brink. Without oil, without allies, without hope of stopping American industry or Soviet armies, the empire had no future. In the end, the real reason Japan lost World War II was not a single event, but a combination of fatal miscalculations. They underestimated America's resolve and industrial might. They overstretched their empire beyond what they could supply. They clung to a military culture that valued sacrifice over strategy. And they misread the shifting geopolitical landscape, failing to anticipate the Soviet Union's decisive move. The atomic bombs were dramatic and horrifying, but they were the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence already written. Japan's story in World War II is a cautionary tale of ambition outrunning resources, of ideology blinding leaders to reality, and of the immense cost when nations misjudge their enemies. The war ended with ruins, but also with lessons that still echo today. That no empire, however fierce or determined, can overcome the weight of strategic overreach and industrial imbalance. And so, while the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki will forever dominate the memory of Japan's defeat, the deeper truth is this: Japan lost the war long before the bombs fell. It lost because its leaders gambled on a war they could never win. Ultimately, Japan's defeat was inevitable, not because of two bombs, but because the foundations of its war effort were built on illusions.